I once believed my life was a masterpiece, a perfect portrait of love and success. I had the marriage everyone dreamed of, until the afternoon I discovered my home was merely the stage for a grand, devastating farce. From our Park Avenue penthouse, the city stretched out below, a glittering kingdom that felt like an extension of the sterling legacy my father had built. But I had happily traded the boardroom for the nursery, swapping stock projections for story time with my two beautiful children. I saw my husband, James, not just as a partner, but as the co-architect of our perfect world. He was charismatic, brilliant, and I believed, completely devoted. I trusted him with my heart, my family, and the keys to an empire I had willingly placed in our shared future. Looking back, that absolute, unquestioning trust wasn't a virtue. It was a fatal flaw, a gilded cage I had built for myself without ever realizing I was the one being trapped. Our life was insulated by a sense of impenetrable harmony. James's parents, John and Martha, were always so effusive with their gratitude, playing the part of doting grandparents who couldn't believe their son's good fortune. They were a constant, reassuring presence at family dinners, their smiles as wide and false as their praise. Even our nanny, Madison Hayes, felt like a gift. She was bright, efficient, and my children adored her. I saw her ambition not as a threat, but as a reflection of my own younger self, and I took pride in mentoring her. I felt so secure, so certain in the loyalty of those I had welcomed into the heart of my family. I was Catherine Sterling, a Wharton graduate with a mind for finance, yet I was blind to the vipers I had invited into my own home. My world wasn't just perfect, it was a carefully constructed illusion, and I was its most willing audience, applauding a performance designed for my utter destruction. The flight back from London was filled with a giddy anticipation that felt foolish in retrospect. I had closed a major acquisition for the European portfolio, a task my father would have handled, but I wanted to prove I still had the sterling touch. My real reward, however, was the thought of surprising the children. I pictured their faces lighting up, the warmth of their small arms around my neck. I bypassed the driver and took a taxi from JFK, eager to shorten the distance between myself and that perfect moment of reunion. As I let myself into the penthouse, the silence was the first thing that struck me as wrong. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping home. It was a heavy, unnerving void. The air was still, holding a secret I was not yet meant to know. My footsteps on the marble floor echoed like a countdown in the unnervingly empty space. A primal instinct, a cold dread coiling in my stomach, pulled me away from the children's wing and down the long gallery toward our master suite. Every piece of art on the walls, once a testament to our shared life, now seemed to mock me. The door to our bedroom was ajar, a sliver of light cutting through the dim hallway. Through that crack, I saw them, my husband, James, and Madison, our children's nanny, in our bed. The sight was a physical blow, a sudden, violent theft of air from my lungs. It was a scene so grotesque, so deeply profane, that my mind initially refused to process it. The betrayal was absolute, staged in the most sacred space of our marriage, a sanctuary now defiled beyond recognition. I was paralyzed, a spectator to the demolition of my own life, watching the foundations crumble in surreal slow motion. But it wasn't the sight that broke me. It was the sound. His voice, the same one that had whispered vows and bedtime stories, dripped with a smug, dismissive cruelty I had never heard before. "Forget Kate," he murmured to Madison, his tone laced with contempt. "You're better than her at everything. In bed, in life. Soon, this penthouse and everything else will be ours." Those words were not the careless whispers of an affair. They were a declaration of war. They were the sound of my own eulogy being delivered by my executioner. In that instant, every loving memory, every shared laugh, every promise we ever made, was incinerated. The man I loved didn't just exist anymore. He had been an illusion, and the creature wearing his face was a stranger, a usurper plotting to steal my children's birthright. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't storm into the room to confront them. A profound and unnatural coldness washed over me, extinguishing the fire of my agony and leaving behind something hard and sharp as a diamond. I backed away from the door, each step silent, precise, and deliberate. My movements felt detached, as if I were piloting a body that was no longer my own. The shock had cauterized the wound, leaving no room for messy, emotional bleeding. I walked to my private study at the far end of the penthouse, the one place that was truly mine, and locked the door behind me. The click of the lock was a definitive sound. It was the closing of a chapter, the sealing of a tomb. The Catherine Sterling who loved James Morgan died in that hallway. And in her place, something far more dangerous was beginning to stir. Inside the sanctuary of my study, surrounded by the blueprints of my father's empire, the full picture crystallized. This wasn't a simple, sordid affair. It was a coup, a meticulously planned conspiracy to dismantle my life, seize my fortune, and erase me from my own family. His parents' fawning praise, Madison's cloying ambition, it all snapped into focus as a coordinated attack. The grief, which should have been a tidal wave, instead flash froze into a glacier of pure, unadulterated resolve. There would be no tears. There would be no heartbreak. There would only be strategy, and there would only be victory. I sat down at my mahogany desk, the city lights twinkling like 1,000 fallen stars outside my window, and opened my laptop. The screen illuminated my face, and I imagined the reflection in it was no longer that of a wife, but of a queen preparing to defend her throne. The war had begun. My fingers traced the cool, polished surface of my father's desk. The grief I should have felt was a distant echo, replaced by a crystalline, Arctic clarity. I wasn't a wife anymore. I was a CEO assessing a hostile takeover. The players were clear. James, the ambitious but insecure COO. Madison, the hungry intern willing to do anything for a promotion. And his parents, the silent, resentful shareholders who believed they were owed a larger dividend. Their objective wasn't my heart, it was my inheritance. The affair was merely a tool, a vulgar but effective means to an end. They sought to dismantle my life brick by brick, starting with my marriage and ending with control of Sterling Enterprises. Confronting them now, in a fit of rage and tears, would be a rookie mistake. It would show my hand, reveal my pain, and give them the very ammunition they needed to paint me as unstable. No, that was their strategy. Mine would be far more sophisticated. My objective was not to salvage a marriage or seek an apology. Apologies are for spilled milk, not for meticulously planned coups. My objective was eradication, complete and total annihilation of their ambitions, their reputations, and their futures. They had attacked me on 3 fronts: my home, my company, and my role as a mother. My response would be a mirror image, a perfectly symmetrical retaliation. I would dismantle their financial foundations until they were penniless. I would shred their social standing until their names were synonymous with disgrace. And most importantly, I would ensure they never again posed a threat to my children's legacy. This wouldn't be a messy divorce. It would be a clinical, corporate restructuring of their lives. I wasn't seeking justice. I was seeking a victory so absolute that their defeat would be studied for generations as a textbook example of what happens when you mistake a lioness for a lamb. Their greatest asset was my perceived weakness. They saw a grieving wife, a heartbroken mother, a woman who had stepped away from the world of high finance and lost her edge. This miscalculation would be their downfall. I would not correct them. Instead, I would lean into their narrative. Starting tomorrow, I would become the role they had cast for me, the shattered victim. I would cry, I would beg, I would perhaps even suggest therapy, feigning a desperate hope to piece our broken family back together. This performance would be my camouflage, a cloak of vulnerability under which the true Catherine Sterling could operate with impunity. While they were busy congratulating each other on their brilliant manipulation, I would be in the shadows, moving assets, gathering intelligence, and setting the board for a checkmate they would never see coming. They thought they were the directors of this tragedy. but I was about to become the sole author of their demise. Every grand strategy begins with a single, decisive move, a quiet action that shifts the terrain of the battlefield before the enemy even knows the war has begun. My gaze fell upon the secure terminal that connected me directly to the Sterling family office and our private bankers at J.P. Morgan. James had grown comfortable, complacent, wielding the power of my family's name as if it were his own. He spent lavishly from accounts he didn't own, funding his future with my past. That ends tonight. The first strike would be financial castration. I would sever his access to every joint account, cancel every credit card issued under the Sterling name, and freeze every asset he foolishly believed he controlled. He would wake up tomorrow a king in his own mind, only to discover his kingdom had vanished overnight. I picked up the encrypted phone, my voice steady and devoid of emotion. The war wasn't coming. It had already started. The call to Arthur Vance, our family's private banker at J.P. Morgan for 3 generations, was the first shot fired in a war James didn't even know had been declared. I made it from my soundproofed study, my voice a calm, level instrument of destruction. "Arthur," I began, foregoing the usual pleasantries. "Effective immediately, I am invoking the Sterling contingency clause on all joint accounts. Code: Black Swan. James Morgan's access is to be revoked across all platforms. Credit, debit, wire transfers, everything. He is to be financially firewalled from Sterling assets." There was no hesitation on his end, just a quiet, "Understood, Catherine. Consider it done." He didn't ask why. He knew my father had put that clause in place for a reason. He knew that Black Swan meant the family was under attack, and my voice told him I was the one launching the counteroffensive. That single, 2-minute phone call dismantled a decade of his parasitic financial comfort. I ended the call and stared out at the city lights. A profound sense of power, cold and clean, settled over me. It was the same feeling I used to get before a major acquisition, the thrill of a calculated risk paying off. James had made the classic mistake of every arrogant fool who marries into power. He confused access with ownership. He believed the Sterling fortune was a well from which he could endlessly draw, never realizing I held the switch to the pump. In his mind, he was a king. In reality, he was a glorified employee with generous stock options that were about to become utterly worthless. The illusion of his power had been his greatest weapon against me, and with a single command, I had turned it to dust. He wouldn't know it yet, but he was already a ghost, haunting a kingdom that no longer recognized him as its ruler. The next morning, I began my performance. When James emerged from the guest room where he'd slept, I was waiting in the kitchen, my face a carefully constructed mask of puffy-eyed devastation. I didn't yell or accuse. I simply looked at him, tears welling on cue, and whispered, "I know you're unhappy, James. Can we please just talk, for the children?" He fell for it completely. His face softened into a patronizing expression of pity, the look of a predator feigning sympathy for its wounded prey. He placed a comforting hand on my arm, his touch making my skin crawl, and assured me we could work through this. He thought my tears were a sign of weakness, of a heartbreaking. He had no idea he was looking at the silent, triumphant glee of a general watching her enemy walk directly into a perfectly laid ambush. The first tangible result of my offensive came that afternoon. I knew James had promised Madison a shopping spree to celebrate their clandestine victory. I pictured the scene with cold satisfaction, the two of them in Bergdorf's, Madison pointing to a 5-figure Birkin bag, her eyes gleaming with avarice. I could almost hear the smug confidence in James's voice as he handed over his American Express black card, the ultimate symbol of his stolen status. And then, the moment of pure, delicious friction. The polite but firm voice of the cashier. "I'm sorry, sir. The card has been declined." The confusion on his face, morphing into disbelief, then into a hot flush of public humiliation. Madison's adoring gaze would curdle into disappointment, and then suspicion. That small, perfect moment of failure was more satisfying than any screaming match could ever be. It was the first crack in the foundation of their sordid little empire. He came home that evening radiating a quiet fury, a storm cloud of bruised ego. He tried to brush it off as a simple administrative error, a technical glitch with the bank's fraud department. "They're getting ridiculous with their security protocols," he grumbled, avoiding my eyes. I played my part beautifully, my brow furrowed with faux concern. "Oh, darling, that's terrible. Let me call Arthur in the morning. We'll get it sorted out together." The panic that flashed in his eyes was priceless. The last thing he wanted was me involved, me talking to the keepers of my own fortune. He was trapped. He couldn't admit to his mistress that his sugar daddy days were over, and he couldn't explain to his wife why he was suddenly persona non grata with our own bank. He was isolated on a financial island of his own making, and the tide was just beginning to rise. That same evening, I met with Mr. Kenzie. He wasn't a private investigator in the traditional sense. He was a ghost, a former Mossad agent who specialized in corporate and psychological warfare, recommended by my father's most trusted attorney. We met in a sterile, anonymous conference room downtown. He was a small, unassuming man, but his eyes held the weight of 1,000 secrets. My instructions to him were precise. "I don't care about photographs of them in bed," I said, my voice as sterile as the room. "Infidelity is a symptom, not the disease. I need proof of a conspiracy. I need their financial dealings, their private conversations, their plans for my company and my children. I need you to dismantle their entire narrative. I'm not building a divorce case, Mr. Kenzie. I'm building a guillotine." He simply nodded, a flicker of professional respect in his gaze. The hunt had officially begun. While Kenzie worked in the shadows, I moved within the corporate structure of Sterling Enterprises. As the majority shareholder, I called a discreet meeting with 3 board members who had been my father's staunchest loyalists for decades. In the hushed wood-paneled quiet of the 80th floor boardroom, I didn't reveal the personal betrayal. Instead, I framed my request in the language they understood: risk management. "I have reason to believe there are significant financial irregularities within James's division," I stated calmly. "I'm initiating a full but quiet forensic audit. I need your absolute discretion. We cannot afford to spook the market or our internal teams." They saw the reflection of my father in my eyes, the same steel, the same strategic foresight. They agreed without question. The corporate arm of my vengeance was now in motion. A silent, meticulous machine grinding away at the pillars of James's professional life. Psychological warfare requires a delicate touch. You don't use a sledgehammer, you use a scalpel. I began to subtly poison the well of trust between James and Madison. One afternoon, I left a jewelry catalog open on the coffee table, circled a diamond necklace identical to one Madison had been fawning over online. When James saw it, the seed of doubt was planted. Was Kate onto them? Had Madison been careless? A few days later, I casually mentioned to James that I'd had a very enlightening preliminary chat with a top divorce attorney, just to understand my options. I watched him struggle to maintain his composure, the paranoia churning behind his eyes. He and Madison, who believed they were master manipulators, were now puppets in my private theater, their strings being pulled by the very person they thought they had broken. Mr. Kenzie's first report was delivered via an encrypted drop. It was a masterclass in intelligence gathering. It contained more than just grainy photos. It held detailed logs of their communications, transcripts of hushed phone calls filled with arrogant plotting. They discussed their future in my home, with my children, funded by my money. One line, from Madison, stood out. "Once we get her declared unstable, the court will have to give you the kids." It's the perfect plan. Reading those words didn't hurt. They were a gift. They were confirmation that this was not a crime of passion, but a premeditated assault on my life and my children's future. Every word they uttered was another nail in their own coffins, and I was merely the one holding the hammer, waiting for the right moment to strike. Even James's parents played their part in my unfolding drama. Martha called me, her voice dripping with the sticky, false sweetness I now recognized as poison. "Catherine, dear, John and I are so worried. James sounds so stressed. Is everything all right with you? Are you feeling yourself? It was a clumsy, transparent attempt to gather intelligence, to probe for any sign of the mental instability they were hoping to manufacture. I played the part of the fragile-eyed, overwhelmed wife to perfection, my voice cracking as I thanked her for her concern. I assured her I was just tired. I let her hang up the phone believing I was weak, oblivious, and crumbling. Their fatal flaw was their arrogance. They so desperately wanted to believe I was a fool that they couldn't see I was the one fooling them. The forensic audit began to yield its first bitter fruits. The auditors, loyal to me, uncovered a series of shell corporations and offshore accounts. James had been siphoning funds from sterling development projects for over a year, embezzling millions to build a nest egg for his new life with Madison. Armed with this preliminary data, I made my next move at the company. I drafted a memo, approved by the loyal board members, announcing a corporate restructuring. Citing the need to streamline operations, I reassigned James's most significant projects to other executives. Publicly, I framed it as a way to alleviate the pressure on him during a difficult personal time. Privately, it was a corporate neutering. I was stripping him of his power, his influence, and his reputation, brick by painstaking brick, all under the guise of wifely concern. Even the best-laid plans encounter turbulence. My moment of near failure came when Kenzie reported that a security sweep, ordered by a paranoid James D., had almost detected one of his listening devices in the penthouse study. They were getting spooked. For a terrifying 24 hours, the audio feed went silent. I felt a flicker of something close to fear. Had I pushed too hard, too fast? I needed their incriminating conversations. Improvising, I used my knowledge of James's colossal ego. I knew he kept a private digital journal, a place to record his genius thoughts. I also knew his password would be a monument to his vanity. I logged into his laptop, typed "The True Sterling," and I was in. The files contained his detailed plans, his contempt for me, his entire strategy. His arrogance had provided the very evidence his paranoia almost concealed. The pressure I was applying began to work exactly as intended, creating fissures in their alliance. Kenzie, having re-established his surveillance, captured their first real fight. The audio was glorious. James, panicked by his dwindling corporate power and frozen accounts, accused Madison of being reckless, of drawing too much attention to them with her demands for luxury goods. She, in turn, called him weak, accusing him of losing his nerve now that the finish line was in sight. "You promised me everything, James," she shrieked. "Don't go soft on me now." Their bond, forged in mutual greed, was not strong enough to withstand the stress of true adversity. They were turning on each other, just as I had predicted. Their conspiracy was beginning to cannibalize itself from the inside out. Then came the moment that sealed their fates. Kenzie delivered the final piece of evidence, the coup de grace. It was a high-fidelity audio recording from a device planted in James's car. On it, James and Madison were speaking with a disgraced doctor, finalizing the plan to have me committed. "The report just needs to say she's paranoid, delusional, a danger to the children," James instructed, his voice chillingly calm. "We'll file for an emergency conservatorship. By the time she realizes what's happening, she'll be in a private facility, and I'll have full control," Madison added. "And no one will believe a word she says." I listened to the recording in my study, the city a silent witness below. There was no anger, no shock. There was only the serene, absolute certainty of a predator whose prey had just willingly walked into the center of a perfectly set trap. With the evidence secured, financial, corporate, and criminal, the silent phase of the war was over. Their assets were frozen. Their professional lives were in ruins. Their alliance was fractured, and their conspiracy was now documented and ready for public display. They were hollowed out, weakened from within, completely unaware that their every move had been anticipated and countered. My performance as the grieving wife had served its purpose. It was time for the CEO to retake the stage. I picked up my phone and called my executive assistant. "Helen," I said, my voice clear and strong, Please schedule the annual Sterling Enterprises board meeting for next Friday and ensure the entire executive team is in attendance. There are some important changes to the company's leadership that I will be announcing personally. The public execution was now on the calendar. The corporate strangulation and financial blockade worked faster than I had anticipated. James began to fray at the edges, the charismatic facade cracking to reveal the panicked, insecure man beneath. He'd pace the length of the penthouse at night, a ghost in his own home, his phone perpetually pressed to his ear in hushed, angry conversations. He grew thin, his expensive suits hanging loosely on a frame consumed by anxiety. He was a predator caught in a snare, and his thrashing only tightened the wire. I would watch him from the shadows of the hallway, a dispassionate observer cataloging the stages of his decay. His desperation was a pungent aroma in our home, a scent I found invigorating. He was beginning to understand that the power he thought he wielded was merely on loan, and the terms of that loan had been irrevocably called. Madison, in turn, was no longer the smug victor-in-waiting. Her youthful ambition curdled into a shrill, demanding panic. Kenzie's surveillance captured their increasingly volatile arguments, beautiful symphonies of greed turning to fear. "You promised me the world, James," she'd cry, her voice a grating whine. "Now I can't even get my nails done without it looking suspicious? What is happening?" He would lash out, his voice a low growl of impotent rage, blaming her for being careless, for pushing too hard, for not understanding the complexities of the game. They were like two rats trapped in a barrel, turning on each other as the water level rose. Their alliance, built on the flimsy foundation of mutual avarice, was crumbling under the first real application of pressure. They had mistaken a partnership for a conspiracy, and they were learning the difference the hard way. The true escalation began with a phone call Kenzie intercepted between James and his mother, Martha. Her voice, usually a syrupy blend of fake concern, was now sharp and conspiratorial. "She's doing this to you, son," Martha hissed. "She's trying to destroy you. You can't let her. You need to remember what we talked about. A woman in her position, under this much stress, they can become unstable, unpredictable." It was the first utterance of their new strategy, the planting of a poisonous seed. They weren't just going to fight me for money or control anymore. They were going to try and erase me, to invalidate my very sanity. They were moving the battle from the boardroom to my mind, and in doing so, they signed their own death warrants. They were no longer just thieves. They were assassins of character. Their plan, as it unfolded through Kenzie's feeds, was as cowardly as it was cruel. They decided to paint me as a paranoid, delusional hysteric, a woman driven mad by the perceived infidelity of her husband. It was a classic, misogynistic playbook, as old as time itself. They would use my grief, the grief I was so expertly performing, as the primary exhibit for their case. Every tear I shed for them would be twisted into a symptom of mental decline. Every sleepless night would be reframed as evidence of an unstable mind. They were going to take the pain they had inflicted upon me and attempt to forge it into a weapon to use against me, a cage to lock me away in. The sheer audacity of their cruelty was breathtaking, but it didn't frighten me. It clarified my purpose. The next phase of their attack required a new player, a corruptible medical professional. They found him in Dr. Alistair Finch, a psychiatrist with a history of gambling debts and a flexible moral compass. Kenzie's report on Finch was thorough. The man was a disgrace to his profession, a vulture who preyed on the wealthy and vulnerable. I listened to the recording of James's first meeting with him, my blood turning to ice. "My wife, she's not herself," James said, his voice a flawless imitation of a concerned husband. "She's having delusions, accusing me of things. I'm worried she could be a danger to herself, or even our children." He was laying the groundwork, brick by despicable brick, for the ultimate betrayal. He wasn't just trying to steal my company, he was trying to steal my children. That was the line, the one they should never have crossed. Until that moment, my vengeance was a strategic game, a corporate chess match where the prize was justice and financial ruin. But the moment they invoked my children's safety, The moment they dared to use them as pawns in their disgusting scheme, the game ended. This was no longer about assets or empires. It was about a mother's primal, territorial imperative to protect her young. The cold, calculating CEO in my mind stepped aside, and a far more ancient, far more ruthless force took its place. They thought they were targeting my weakness, but they had just awakened a strength they could not possibly comprehend. They had declared war on a mother, and they were about to learn that there is no force on earth more devastating. Madison played her part with a sickeningly sweet devotion. She began keeping a detailed journal, supposedly documenting my erratic behavior. Kenzie's team procured a copy. It was a work of pure fiction, filled with fabricated accounts of me weeping uncontrollably, forgetting the children's schedules, and whispering to myself in empty rooms. She described me as a fragile ghost haunting my own home. This journal, this collection of lies, was to be their cornerstone of evidence, a testament to my supposed descent into madness. Every line she wrote was another shovel of dirt on the grave they were digging for themselves. They were so consumed with building their false narrative that they never once stopped to consider that I was building a real one, documented with irrefutable proof. Even the in-laws, John and Martha, were mobilized. They began calling my friends, my social contacts, even the children's school, planting seeds of concern. "We're just so worried about Catherine," they would say, their voices laden with practiced sorrow. "She seems to be under an immense strain. We're not sure she's coping." They were creating a chorus of whispers, a subtle campaign to isolate me and pre-validate the diagnosis they were about to purchase from Dr. Finch. They were poisoning every well, burning every bridge, ensuring that when they made their move, no one would come to my aid. They underestimated the loyalty I had cultivated, but more importantly, they underestimated my ability to build a fortress they could never breach. Their social campaign was a pathetic little siege against a castle they couldn't even see. The bribe itself was almost insultingly clumsy. Kenzie's surveillance captured the exchange in a grainy but undeniable video. James met Dr. Finch in a private club downtown, a place where men like them trade souls over expensive scotch. A thick manila envelope slid across the table. "This is for your professional assessment," James murmured, the audio clear as a bell. "And for your discretion." Finch pocketed the envelope without even looking inside. "The report will reflect the severity of your wife's condition," the doctor replied smoothly. "Paranoid delusions, emotional instability, a clear danger to the children's welfare. It will be more than enough for an emergency hearing." They shook hands, sealing a pact that would ultimately seal their doom. They had just been filmed committing conspiracy and fraud. Checkmate. With their paid-for diagnosis and Madison's fictional journal, they were ready to launch their final assault. Their lawyer, a bottom feeder known for his aggressive tactics in high-stakes divorces, drew up the legal motion. It was an emergency petition for a temporary conservatorship, citing my acute psychological distress and inability to act in my own or my children's best interests. The document was a masterpiece of legal fiction, painting James as the heroic husband trying to save his family from a mentally collapsing matriarch. It requested full control of my personal assets and, most cruelly, sole physical custody of our children, pending a full psychiatric evaluation which would, of course, be conducted by their puppet, Drs. Finch. They chose to serve the papers in the most humiliating way possible. I was hosting a luncheon for a children's charity I chaired, surrounded by some of New York's most influential women. As I was giving a speech, a process server walked calmly to the front of the room and handed me the legal documents. A hush fell over the grand dining hall. I could feel dozens of pairs of eyes on me, watching, waiting for my reaction. I saw the faint, triumphant smirk on the face of one of Martha's friends at a nearby table. This was their intended theater of humiliation. They wanted me to break down, to cry, to prove their case for them in front of everyone. They wanted to strip me of my dignity before they stripped me of my freedom. I looked down at the documents in my hand, my heart beating with a slow, steady, and triumphant rhythm. I didn't crumble. I didn't even flinch. I simply paused, gave the room a small, apologetic smile and said, "My apologies, ladies. It seems my husband has some urgent family business he wishes to discuss." I folded the papers neatly, placed them on the podium, and continued my speech without missing a beat. The room, which had been holding its collective breath, relaxed. My composure was my shield and my sword. It was the one reaction they hadn't planned for. In their minds, I was already a shattered mess. They couldn't comprehend the woman standing before them, a queen on her throne, calmly regarding a declaration of war as if it were a minor inconvenience. That night, the reality of their attack settled in, not as fear, but as a final, clarifying fire. They had come for everything: my home, my fortune, my company, my reputation, my freedom, and my children. There was nothing left for them to threaten. They had played their final, most desperate card, and in doing so, had given me the one thing I still needed: the unassailable moral authority to utterly and completely destroy them without a shred of mercy. My planned response was no longer just about justice or revenge. It was about survival. It was about ensuring these vipers could never again get close enough to strike at me or my family. The boardroom meeting scheduled for Friday was no longer just a corporate restructuring. It was an execution. I spent the next few days in a state of hyper-focused calm. I met with my own legal team, a phalanx of the most ruthless corporate and criminal lawyers in the country. I laid out Kenzie's evidence on a vast conference table: the financial audits showing embezzlement, the audio recordings of their conspiracy, the video of the bribe, Madison's fraudulent journal, and their own damning legal petition. My lead attorney, a formidable woman named Eleanor Vance, looked at the mountain of evidence, then at me. There was no pity in her eyes, only a profound and chilling respect. "Catherine," she said, her voice a low hum of anticipation, "what they have done is not just grounds for divorce. This is a criminal enterprise. What precisely is your desired outcome?" "My desired outcome," I replied, my voice perfectly level, "is total annihilation. I want James arrested in that boardroom. I want Madison charged as a co-conspirator. I want Dr. Finch to lose his license and face prosecution. I want their names to become a permanent stain. A cautionary tale whispered at every gala and charity event in this city for the next 50 years. I don't want a settlement. I don't want a quiet divorce. I want a public crucifixion. I want them to have nothing and to be nothing. I want to take back everything they tried to steal from me, and I want to do it in the most public and humiliating way imaginable." Eleanor simply nodded, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. "Consider it done," she said. The day before the board meeting, James made one last arrogant move. He came to my study, the petition for conservatorship giving him a renewed sense of confidence. He tried to play the role of the sorrowful, long-suffering husband. "Kate, I'm doing this for your own good, for the children," he said, his eyes full of fake pity. "Just sign the papers. Agree to the treatment. We can get through this quietly. Don't force my hand and make this a public spectacle." He actually believed he was in control. He believed his pathetic, forged document gave him power over me. He stood there, in the heart of my fortress, lecturing me on the terms of my own surrender, completely oblivious to the tidal wave of retribution that was about to crash down upon him. I looked up from my desk, meeting his gaze with a serene calm that seemed to unnerve him. "A public spectacle, James?" I asked, my voice soft and laced with an irony he was too dense to detect. "Why would I ever want to avoid that? I think it's important for people to see the truth. Don't you?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, but his arrogance quickly smothered it. He shook his head, sighed theatrically, and said, "I tried, Kate. Remember that I tried to be kind." He turned and left, confident that he had given me my final chance. He had no idea that I was the one who had just given him his. He had walked out of that room a condemned man, utterly ignorant of the execution scheduled for the following morning. I contacted the nanny agency that had placed Madison with us. I provided them with a preliminary, heavily redacted summary of her conduct, framing it as a severe breach of contract and a potential criminal matter. I didn't need them to act immediately. I just needed to put them on notice. Her professional reputation, the one thing she might have salvaged from the wreckage, was now a ticking time bomb. When the full story broke, the agency would have no choice but to blacklist her permanently, ensuring she could never again work with children or inveigle her way into another family's home. It was a small, precise strike, but a necessary one. Every pillar of her imagined future had to be demolished. My final call of the evening was to my head of security, a former Secret Service agent my father had trusted implicitly. My instructions were simple and direct. For tomorrow's board meeting, I said, I need 2 plainclothes officers from the NYPD's white-collar crime division waiting discreetly in the anteroom. They are not to make their presence known until I give a specific verbal cue. The cue will be the phrase, "And that concludes the audit." Is that understood? There was no question, only a calm, "Yes, Mrs. Morgan." The arrangements will be made. The trap was now fully set. The legal team was primed, the evidence was loaded, and law enforcement was in position. All that was left was for the condemned to walk willingly to the gallows. I slept soundly that night for the first time in weeks. The anxiety, the tension, the carefully managed rage, it had all coalesced into a singular diamond-hard purpose. There were no more variables, no more uncertainties. My enemies had made their final, fatal move, and in doing so, had handed me the perfect weapon for their own destruction. They had threatened my children, and in the ancient law that governs a mother's heart, the only possible sentence for such a crime is absolute ruin. I was not just a wronged wife seeking revenge anymore. I was an instrument of a much more profound and elemental justice. The woman who woke up the next morning was not Catherine Sterling Morgan. She was Catherine Sterling, heir to an empire, protector of her legacy, and the executioner of those who had dared to threaten it. On the morning of the board meeting, I chose my armor with meticulous care. A custom-made Alexander McQueen power suit in a deep, blood red. It was a statement. It was a warning. As I dressed, I felt a profound transformation solidifying within me. The soft, trusting woman who had returned from London weeks ago was gone forever, burned away in the crucible of betrayal. In her place stood someone colder, stronger, and infinitely more dangerous. I was no longer playing a part. I had become the part, the CEO, the matriarch, the queen. I looked at my reflection in the mirror, and for the first time, I saw my father's eyes staring back at me, filled not with warmth, but with the chillingly clear light of absolute power and unwavering resolve. I walked into the kitchen to find James already dressed, radiating a smug, pre-victory confidence. He was wearing his most expensive Brioni suit, the one he always wore when he was about to close a major deal. He saw my red suit and raised an eyebrow. "Dressing for a funeral, Kate?" he asked with a condescending smirk. I smiled back, a genuine, serene smile that seemed to confuse him. "Something like that, James," I replied, my voice as smooth as silk. "You have no idea." He thought he was walking into his coronation. In reality, he was a dead man walking, dressed in his finest for his own execution. The dramatic irony was so thick, so delicious, I could almost taste it. Before we left for the office, I went into my children's rooms. They were still asleep, their faces peaceful and angelic in the soft morning light. I kissed each of them on the forehead, a silent vow passing from my lips to their skin. "This is for you. Everything I am about to do is to protect you, to secure your future, to ensure that no one will ever harm you again." The warmth of their presence was a stark contrast to the ice in my veins. They were my why. They were the reason for the calculated devastation I was about to unleash. This wasn't just about punishing the wicked. It was about protecting the innocent. It was the truest and most righteous strength of a mother. As the elevator ascended to the 80th floor boardroom, a quiet calm settled over me. James made small talk, discussing the stock market, completely oblivious to the fact that his entire world was about to be liquidated. I simply nodded along, my mind a silent, whirring supercomputer running final checks on the sequence of events I had planned. The doors opened onto the hushed, opulent reception area of the executive suite. I could see the board members already gathering inside, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern. They had all received the agenda, which simply read, "A special presentation by Catherine Sterling regarding the future of corporate leadership." They had no idea they were about to witness a hostile takeover of a very different kind. James placed a proprietary hand on the small of my back as we entered the boardroom, a final act of performative concern for the benefit of the board. "Are you sure you're up for this, Kate?" he whispered, his voice oozing false sympathy. I gently removed his hand and turned to face him, my eyes locking onto his. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life, James," I said, my voice low and clear. The finality in my tone gave him his first real pause of the day. A flicker of doubt, small but distinct, appeared in his eyes. It was too late. The doors to the boardroom closed behind us with a heavy, definitive click. The theater was set. The audience was seated. The execution was about to begin. I watched as James took his seat at the long mahogany table, positioning himself near the head, as if he already owned it. He exchanged confident nods with the few board members he believed he had swayed to his side. His lawyer sat behind him, a leather briefcase containing my fabricated psychiatric report resting on his lap. They were so sure of their victory, so wrapped in their cocoon of arrogance. They saw me as the final, fragile obstacle to be swept aside. They had no conception of the truth, that they were not the predators closing in for the kill. They were the prey, and the doors to the abattoir had just been locked behind them. The room quieted as I walked to the head of the table, taking my father's seat for the first time since his passing. I felt his presence, his strength, flowing through me. I looked around at the faces of the men and women who held the company's fate in their hands. They were my father's people, my people. "Good morning, everyone," I began, my voice resonating with a calm authority that commanded immediate attention. "Thank you for coming. I know the agenda was vague, but I believe in clarity and transparency. Today, we are here to address a cancer that has been growing within this company, a threat not just to our bottom line, but to the very integrity of the Sterling name." All eyes turned to James, whose confident smirk began to falter. I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes as he realized this wasn't going the way he had planned. He started to rise, his lawyer placing a hand on his arm. "Catherine, perhaps this is a discussion best had in private," he interjected, trying to seize control. I held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "On the contrary, James," I said, my voice dropping to an icy calm. "This is a discussion that requires the full light of day. It's about a conspiracy so audacious, so deeply corrupt, that it must be exposed here and now, in front of the people sworn to protect this company." I gestured to the massive screen behind me. "Let's begin with the forensic audit of your division, shall we?" The first slide appeared, showing the intricate web of shell corporations and offshore accounts. The color drained from James's face as I walked the board through his systematic embezzlement, detailing every stolen dollar, every fraudulent invoice. The numbers were stark, undeniable. The air in the room grew thick with tension. The board members who had once supported him now stared at him with expressions of cold fury and disbelief. I was dismantling his professional identity, piece by piece, with cold, hard facts. He was no longer the brilliant COO. He was a common thief, exposed in a room full of the very people he had tried so desperately to impress. His corporate life was over. He just didn't know how much more he was about to lose. Then, I moved to the next phase of the presentation. Financial malfeasance, however, was merely a symptom of a much deeper rot, I announced, my voice devoid of emotion. The conspiracy went far beyond simple greed. It was an attempt to seize total control of Sterling Enterprises by incapacitating its majority shareholder. I looked directly at James, whose eyes were wide with a dawning, animal terror. "Specifically, me!" His lawyer shot to his feet, shouting, "These are baseless and slanderous accusations. My client's only concern has been for his wife's fragile mental state." It was the perfect cue. "Fragile?" I asked, a dangerous smile playing on my lips. "Let's listen to just how concerned he was." With a click of the remote, the first audio file played, filling the silent boardroom with James's voice, captured by Kenzie's device. The report just needs to say she's paranoid, delusional, a danger to the children, his voice echoed, chillingly calm. We'll file for an emergency conservatorship. By the time she realizes what's happening, she'll be in a private facility. The board sat frozen, stunned into silence. I then played the clip of Madison's voice, and no one will believe a word she says. The collective gasp in the room was a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. James looked as if he had been physically struck, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. He had been so sure of his own genius. He never imagined I could be smarter. The final piece of evidence was the video. Of course, to get such a convenient diagnosis, one needs a doctor with a certain flexibility, I explained, as the grainy surveillance footage of James bribing Dr. Finch appeared on the screen. The image of the envelope sliding across the table, the sound of their hushed criminal agreement. It was the nail in the coffin. The conspiracy was laid bare, irrefutable and grotesque. James's lawyer sank back into his chair, his face ashen. He knew the case wasn't just lost, it was radioactive. James himself was paralyzed, a statue of a broken man, his entire world demolished in the space of 10 minutes. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, allowing the full weight of his depravity to settle upon the room. Then, I turned my gaze back to the board. This was not a marital dispute, I said, my voice ringing with absolute conviction. This was a premeditated corporate and criminal attack on this company, its leadership, and its legacy. It was an attempt to steal everything my father built, everything I am sworn to protect. I paused, then delivered the final, decisive blow. And that concludes the audit. It was the cue. As if on command, the boardroom doors opened, and the two plainclothes NYPD detectives walked calmly into the room, their eyes fixed on one person, James Morgan. The desperate escalation had met its final, definitive end. The lead detective, a man with a face carved from granite and eyes that missed nothing, walked past me and stopped directly in front of James. There was no rush, no overt aggression, just an overwhelming sense of inevitable authority. The air in the room, already thick with shock, became still and heavy. James stared at the detective, then at me, his mind clearly struggling to process this new, terrifying variable in an equation he thought he had already solved. He had prepared for a corporate battle, a war of words and legal motions. He had never, in his wildest arrogance, prepared for the cold, impartial machinery of the law to come for him personally. This was no longer a boardroom. It had become a courtroom, and judgment was being rendered in real time. The look on his face was a beautiful, chaotic symphony of confusion morphing into pure, unadulterated terror. He was a king who had just realized his throne was an electric chair. James finally found his voice, but it was a pathetic, blustering imitation of his usual commanding tone. "There must be some mistake," he stammered, looking around the table for support from allies who now refused to meet his gaze. "This is a private corporate matter. My wife is unwell. She's not thinking clearly." His lawyer, a man who had been a shark just minutes before, was now a pale, sweating minnow, shuffling papers as if they could offer him a shield. It was fascinating to watch. James's entire life had been built on the power of his words, to charm, to persuade, to deceive. But in this room, against the stark, digital evidence of his crimes and the silent authority of the law, his words were just empty noise, the desperate last gasps of a drowning man trying to argue with the ocean. He was trying to sell a narrative that everyone in the room had just watched me burn to the ground. The detective didn't even glance at me. His focus was entirely on James. "James Morgan," he said, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "You're being placed under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, multiple counts of wire fraud, and embezzlement from Sterling Enterprises." He gestured with his chin toward the massive screen behind me, where the flowchart of James's offshore accounts was still displayed like a piece of modern art. We have a warrant for your arrest and for the seizure of all related financial records. Each word was a hammer blow, systematically dismantling the identity of James Morgan, COO, and replacing it with James Morgan, federal criminal. The board members, men and women of immense power and influence, watched in absolute silence, their faces grim. They were witnessing not just the fall of a man, but the swift, brutal cleansing of their own house. The sound of the handcuffs was not a loud click, but a soft, metallic whisper that seemed to scream in the cathedral-like silence of the boardroom. That small sound was the full stop at the end of a long and sordid sentence. It was the closing of a door that would never reopen. I watched as James's hands were secured behind his back, his expensive Brioni suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume on a man stripped of all power. He didn't struggle. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a hollow, vacant shock. I felt no surge of vindictive glee, no fiery passion. Instead, a profound and serene sense of completion washed over me. It was the quiet, clean satisfaction of a complex equation being solved, of a grand strategy executed to flawless perfection. The king had been checkmated, his pieces swept from the board with clinical precision. As the detectives led a ghost-white James from the room, I turned my attention back to the stunned faces around the table. I did not allow a single crack in my composure. "As of this moment," I announced, my voice ringing with an authority no one dared question, "I am assuming the role of acting CEO of Sterling Enterprises. Our legal team and a crisis communications firm are already in place to manage the fallout. A full internal review will be conducted, but let me be clear, the disease has been excised. The company is strong, its foundations are secure, and its future begins now." I looked into the eyes of my father's most loyal board members, and I saw not doubt, but a dawning respect. They weren't looking at a victim anymore. They were looking at their new leader, a queen who had just defended her throne with terrifying efficiency. The ripples of my victory spread through the city with the speed of a digital wildfire. While James was being processed downtown, another pair of detectives arrived at our Park Avenue penthouse. They found Madison not preparing for a celebratory gala, but lounging in my silk robe, her feet on my coffee table, still living inside the fantasy that was already ashes. Her arrest was a far less dignified affair. There was no silent boardroom, only the quiet judgment of the building's staff as she was led, sputtering and crying, through the marble lobby she had so recently believed she would own. Her ambition had been a rocket, and she had strapped herself to it, never considering that it was aimed not at the stars, but directly at the ground. She was left with nothing but the consequences of her own avarice, a footnote in the story of my ascension. The other dominoes fell with satisfying speed. Dr. Alistair Finch was arrested in his Park Avenue office, in front of his wealthy patients, for conspiracy and medical fraud. The State Medical Board received a full, unredacted copy of my evidence, ensuring his license would be permanently revoked. For John and Martha Morgan, I chose a different kind of prison. I didn't press charges. Instead, I gave the entire story, complete with their encouraging text messages to James, to the city's most voracious society columnist. Their punishment was not legal, but social. They became pariahs overnight, their names whispered with contempt at the galas they could no longer attend, their invitations rescinded, their phone calls unanswered. I had sentenced them to a life of public shame, a slow, suffocating death in the very social circles they so desperately coveted. When the boardroom was finally empty, I stood alone at the vast window, looking down at the city spread before me like a map of my kingdom. The lights of Manhattan glittered, not like fallen stars anymore, but like a crown of diamonds. I had taken their worst betrayal and forged it into a weapon. I had absorbed their most vicious attacks and turned their energy back on them 1,000-fold. James's cruelest words echoed in my mind, not as an insult, but as a prophecy he had unknowingly fulfilled. "She's better than you at everything." He was right. I was better at strategy, better at execution, and better at winning. They had tried to destroy a wife and mother, and in their failure, they had unleashed a queen. The true strength of a mother wasn't just to protect her legacy, it was to become it. And I was just getting started. The aftermath was not a chaotic media storm. It was a perfectly orchestrated press release. Before James's mugshot even hit the evening news, my crisis team had framed the narrative. He was not a cheating husband. He was a disgraced executive removed for gross financial misconduct. The affair was a sordid but secondary detail, a footnote in a larger story of corporate integrity being restored. I controlled the story because I had authored it. Every news report, every industry blog, every whispered conversation at every country club repeated the version of events I had meticulously crafted. I didn't just win the war. I wrote the history of it in real time, casting myself not as the victim, but as the swift, decisive leader who purged a sickness from her own company. His attempt at public humiliation had become the platform for my public coronation, a masterclass in turning an enemy's weapon into a crown. James's descent was as swift as it was absolute. Bail was denied. The evidence against him was a digital mountain so vast and detailed that his high-priced lawyers could only stare at it in defeat. I pictured him that first night, stripped of his Brioni suit and his custom-made watch, shivering in the sterile chill of a holding cell. The man who had plotted to steal a Park Avenue empire was now a ward of the state. His future measured not in stock options, but in a federal prison sentence. He had mistaken my love for weakness and my home for a prize to be won. He learned, far too late, that the sterling legacy was not a house to be occupied, but a fortress, and I was the one who held all the keys, including the one that now locked his cell door. His fall was not a tragedy. It was a simple correction of a market imbalance he had created. Madison's fall was quieter but no less complete. She was arrested as a co-conspirator, her tearful, photogenic plea of being a manipulated young woman falling on deaf ears. The evidence of her active participation in the fraud and the plot against me was undeniable. The nanny agency, horrified by the scandal, immediately blacklisted her and issued a public statement condemning her actions. Her dream of a life of luxury evaporated, replaced by a nightmare of mounting legal bills and public infamy. She had seen me as a relic to be replaced, an obstacle to her ambition. Now, she was nothing. A cautionary tale, a ghost haunting the gossip columns, stripped of the beauty and youth she had tried to weaponize. She had hitched her wagon to a falling star, and now she was just another piece of wreckage scattered across the ground, utterly forgotten. For John and Martha, I reserved a special kind of justice. Prison was too simple, too private. Their crime was one of social climbing and vicarious greed, so their punishment had to be social. I didn't sue them. I simply gave the full, unedited transcript of their encouraging calls and texts to James, to the city's most feared society columnist. The story that ran was a masterpiece of subtle evisceration, painting them as grasping, resentful parasites. The fallout was immediate. They were erased from every charity board, their names struck from every guest list. They became social lepers, forced to live out their days in the quiet, agonizing hell of public irrelevance, a prison with invisible walls built from the shame and contempt of the very people whose approval they so desperately craved. Their ambition to have a piece of my world ended with them being cast out of their own. Dr. Alistair Finch's ruin was a clean, surgical strike. Armed with the unassailable video evidence of his bribe, the district attorney's office moved swiftly. He was arrested for conspiracy and medical fraud, his professional life ending in a blaze of flashing cameras outside his own clinic. The state medical board, presented with my evidence, summarily revoked his license. His name, once associated with discreet and expensive therapy, was now synonymous with corruption. Lawsuits from dozens of former patients, now questioning his past diagnoses, began to pile up, ensuring his financial ruin would be as complete as his professional one. He was a mercenary who had chosen the wrong side in a war he didn't understand, and he paid the price with the absolute destruction of the life and reputation he had sold out for a single envelope of cash. My first official act as the new CEO of Sterling Enterprises was to address our global workforce via a company-wide broadcast. I stood not in a boardroom, but on the factory floor of one of our tech subsidiaries, surrounded by the engineers and designers who were the true heart of the company. I didn't mention the betrayal. I spoke of the future. I laid out a new, aggressive vision for innovation, for expansion, for a new era of transparency and meritocracy. I made it clear that the Sterling name would no longer be a crutch for the connected, but a platform for the brilliant. The message was clear. The era of the parasite was over. The era of the builder had begun. I felt the shift in the company's atmosphere almost immediately, a surge of energy, of renewed purpose. I hadn't just taken control. I had earned it. The process of financial recovery became a quiet obsession. My legal and financial teams moved with ruthless efficiency, clawing back every dollar James had embezzled. We dismantled his network of shell corporations, seized the offshore accounts, and liquidated every asset he had purchased with stolen funds. The final sum recovered was staggering, but instead of absorbing it back into the corporate coffers, I did something my father never would have. I used the money to establish the Sterling Foundation for Economic Justice, an organization dedicated to providing legal and financial support for women and children victimized by domestic financial abuse. I had taken the proceeds of his attempt to destroy me and forged them into a shield for thousands of others. My victory wasn't just personal. It was now a legacy of empowerment. In the quiet of my study, I found an old photograph from our wedding day. I looked at the smiling, trusting face of the woman I used to be. There was no grief, no sense of loss. I felt only a dispassionate pity for her naivete, the way one might feel for a historical figure who could not see the coming revolution. That woman had to die in that hallway for me to be born. Her trust was a liability. My clarity is an asset. Her love was a vulnerability. My resolve is a weapon. I did not mourn her passing. I honored her sacrifice. She was the foundation upon which my empire was being rebuilt. A softer, weaker version of myself that had to be razed to the ground to make way for the steel and glass of who I had become. The past was no longer a home, it was simply a case study. I did not attend their sentencing hearings. My presence would have dignified the proceedings, framing them as the climax of a personal drama. They were not. They were a business matter that had been concluded. I read the news on my tablet while approving a new architectural plan for our Tokyo Tower. James received a sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Madison, for her cooperation, received 5. Their fates were a distant echo, a closed chapter in a book I was no longer reading. My world was now filled with acquisition targets, market projections, and my children's laughter. The space they had occupied in my mind, once a gaping wound, had been cauterized and repurposed into a source of cold, hard strength. They were no longer my enemies. They were simply irrelevant. Our new family life found its own rhythm, quieter and stronger than before. The gaping void left by James was filled not by a new man, but by a deeper connection with my children. One evening, as I tucked them into bed, my son asked me to tell him a story. I didn't read from a book. I told him a story about a wise queen whose kingdom was threatened by cunning dragons. But instead of fighting them with fire, she outsmarted them, using their own greed to lead them into a trap from which they could never escape. She didn't just save her kingdom, she made it stronger and safer than ever before. My daughter looked at me, her eyes wide with admiration. "You're the queen, Mommy," she whispered. I smiled and kissed her forehead. "Yes," I said, "I am." The business world, ever watchful, decided to test the new queen, a rival real estate magnate. A man who had always viewed my father as his primary competitor, attempted a subtle but hostile play for a key portfolio of our European properties. He saw a woman distracted by scandal, an empire in flux. He miscalculated catastrophically. In response, I didn't just defend, I attacked. Over the course of 72 hours, my team and I executed a complex financial maneuver that not only secured our properties, but also exploited a weakness in his own holdings, allowing us to acquire his most profitable subsidiary at a fraction of its market value. The news sent a shockwave through the industry. The message was delivered with brutal clarity. Catherine Sterling was not her father's daughter. She was something new, something far more dangerous to cross. I now stand in my office, the one my father built, its windows framing the entirety of the Manhattan skyline. It's late, but the city is a galaxy of light, a kingdom humming with power. My power. My children are asleep in a small, private room I had built adjoining my office, safe and secure. I look down at the city lights, the veins of gold and silver running through the heart of my empire, and I finally understand the phrase I had once whispered to myself. The true strength of a mother wasn't just a defensive instinct. It was the absolute, unwavering will to conquer any threat, to dismantle any enemy, and to build a world so secure, so powerful, that her children would never know anything but safety and strength. They tried to take my home. In response, I took the world.